at the end of the day,
Good morning, everyone. Ladies and gentlemen. Gentlemen, we got two here, sorry. Welcome, glad you guys are here. I'm glad we got a good crowd to start here this morning. I'm very pleased to introduce Kathy Parker to you. Kathy is the School Library Media Consultant for North Carolina Department of Public Instruction. I hope I got your title right.
You did.
All right. It's a mouthful, as the School Library Media Coordinators know. But we're very excited to have her here to talk about the new evaluation instrument because while you have experience with the teacher instrument, there are obviously some differences, and she is the expert in this area, so I wanted to ask her to come in. And I'm just impressed that you guys came for the first session, so I'll turn it over to her. Thank you, Kathy.
Thanks, Grant.
Yep.
First thing we probably need to do is for those of you with devices, if you will go ahead and navigate to this wiki. Whenever I do staff development in conferences or with school systems, I like to have everything in one place for you all so that if you are sharing this information, which hopefully you are going to be sharing this information with school library media coordinators who could not be here today, or possibly administrators who could not be here today, I want it to all be in one place for you all to find. I also have
Kathy, let me get the password real quick in case somebody wants the
Okay,
password. It's public with a capital P, and then 805. The number 805. Public with a capital P, and then 805. And it's the wireless network number 2.
And there is a sign-in, there's a little Google sign-in form just for your name and your school, so those of you with devices will sign in. I like to know who I'm working with and what schools are represented. So if you'll take a second to do that, I'm going to give everybody a minute to get to the wiki. And while you're doing that, I'll just talk to you a little bit about myself and my background. I was a high school English teacher for quite a few years before I transitioned over to library media. And then I was a school library media coordinator at an elementary school for 7 years and at a high school for about 10 years. And I joined the Department of Public Instruction a year ago. So I've been a school library media consultant for DPI for a year now. And right now, one of the main things that I've been working with school library media coordinators and administrators with, of course, is the evaluation instrument, because our professional standards for school library media coordinators are several years old. But last year we piloted the evaluation instrument. Some of the schools piloted that, and then this year it has been implemented in August. And I know earlier in August there was a little bit of confusion because the timelines changed of whether we use the new instrument now or if we're still using the MCPAIR. So we are definitely using the new instrument now, and so I've been working with library media coordinators to make sure library media coordinators understand the process and the performance expectations, and also with administrators, because there are definitely some differences in the teacher process and the school library media process, and there are a lot of differences in what the expectations are for school library media coordinators. Because in the last few years, our roles as school library media coordinators have really changed. And now, the demands of education dictate that as school library media coordinators, we are not just leaders in our library media programs, but leaders in our schools and leaders in our districts. So the new standards and the new evaluation instrument for library media coordinators, you'll notice if you haven't already, that there's a great emphasis on leadership. There's a great emphasis on collaboration with school library media coordinators and teachers and administrators. And even the evaluation instrument is a good example of that, because the process really is a partnership between the school library media coordinators and administrators, and we'll talk more about that. And there's a greater emphasis on school library media coordinators as instructors. And the idea with instruction, of course, is that it's co-instruction. It's collaborating with teachers to co-design and co-instruct lessons with students. So we'll get into that with the evaluation instrument. So that's what I've been working with across the state in the last 6 months. And as I mentioned, everything should need for the evaluation instrument is housed on this wiki. We're going to start with looking at the actual steps to the evaluation process and get any questions that you have about that. Then we're going to look specifically at performance descriptors in the rubric to note some of the things that are new, that are changes for library media coordinators, like I mentioned, with leadership and collaboration and co-instruction. And then we'll talk about artifacts, because I get a lot of questions from the field about what appropriate artifacts are. So hopefully we'll get all of that in today and time for questions. On the wiki, there is a link to my email. Just click on my name. You are welcome at any time during this process to email me. I got a question last night from a school district who's actually doing staff development today on the instrument and needed a link to some information that I have. And so I emailed them last night about it. So please feel free, library media coordinators, email me when you have questions, administrators, a couple of weeks from now, you're in this process and something comes up, shoot me an email, and I will definitely respond. So let's start with the evaluation instrument process. If you have school library media coordinators or administrators who could not be here today, I want you to make sure that you share this with them, because at the top, there is a link to the school library media coordinator evaluation instrument user's guide, and it has very detailed instructions on the evaluation process and scoring the rubric and all of that stuff. So there's a link there to the user's guide. It takes you to the North Carolina Educator Evaluation Systems Wiki. And so one of the things that I want to make sure we don't have any misconceptions about after today, because I get lots of emails about this, is that the resources that you need as an administrator and that you need as a school library media coordinator to do the evaluation instrument are all housed on the North Carolina Educator Evaluator System Wiki. It's not part of Homebase. Right now, the only people who do their evaluations through Homebase are teachers. And have they got administrators in there yet? They were working on administrators, so I don't know if administrators are in Homebase yet or not. I think they may be. But support staff, school library media coordinators, counselors, ITFs, I'm not sure if you all have ITFs, but if you do, all of the resources that you need for the evaluation instrument are on the NCEEF wiki. And that is linked right here. When you click to look at the user's guide, you'll share this with others. It will take you to the NESAS. That's what the common terminology is, the NESAS wiki. And you just scroll down, and there's the school library media coordinators section. So you'll see that there's the evaluation process user's guide, the PDP, PDP and PGP, so professional development plan and professional growth plan. Those terms are used interchangeably in the user's guide. So it's the same thing. Whether it refers to a PGP or a PDP, it's the same form, same instructions. That's available here on the NESAS wiki. The rubric for self-assessment, we'll look at one of the steps in the process. School library media coordinators complete the rubric and assess themselves. That's the same rubric evaluators use. So I've gotten some emails about, I see the rubric for self-assessment, but where's the rubric that I use as an administrator? It's the same thing. It's the same rubric. So that link is there as well. There is a summary rating sheet that is optional, and there's a summary rating form that is required for evaluators to use, and those are here, housed here as well. So just a reminder that those resources are found on NESAS. They are not part of Homebase. You also noticed at the top that I had webcasts posted. So for those who could not be here, or if a couple of weeks from now you want to review this, go back. There's a webcast that I've posted. It's about 10 minutes for the process, and there's one that's about 5 minutes for scoring the rubric. Okay? So share those with others who weren't able to be here. So let's take a look, first of all, at this infographic that I have. And I created this to kind of be a self-study, so for those who are independent learners and want to sit down and go through this tutorial themselves, they can. The first step in the evaluation instrument process is training, okay? So you all are getting training right now. Probably before now, some of you have gone through, some of you may have had these links, some of you already knew about the user's guide. We had training earlier in the year, in the summer. If any of you were part of the Summer Institute, you may have had training then. But training for the evaluation process can come in a variety of formats. It could be training like this from DPI, it could be training your LEA has provided, it could be self-study, like going through this tutorial as well. But the first step of the process is that evaluators and school library media coordinators have to be trained on the instrument. Okay? The next step is orientation. And orientation should take place within the first 2 weeks of school. And orientation, basically what's involved in orientation is that the administrator that's going to be evaluating the school library media coordinator touches base with the school library media coordinator, lets the school library media coordinator know where to find the rubric, where to find the user's guide, maybe direct them to the electronic version, or maybe give them a print version. It's up to you as the evaluator. What you'd like to do for that. But you make sure that your school library media coordinator has the resources necessary, and that you also provide a schedule of the steps in the process, a schedule of when the observations are going to be, all of that kind of stuff. That's part of the orientation. So that's the second step. And stop me at any time if you have questions, and I'll take questions at the end also. But if there's a certain question that you have when we get to one of the steps, please stop me. The next step is the self-assessment for school library media coordinators. And the self-assessment involves the school library media coordinator reflecting on his or her practice. So they go through the rubric and rate their performance, how they view their performance based on, what they did last year. The self-assessment, one of the things I like to point out for school library media coordinators is although it is step number 3 in the process, it's not a one-time deal. You don't just do the self-assessment at the beginning of the year. The self-assessment is ongoing, okay? So you do the self-assessment at the beginning of the process, but then throughout the year you come back to it and reflect on your practice and note, because there are going to be some things that you do throughout the year that you didn't know you were going to do. You could not have predicted that you were going to do it, and now there are other areas on that self-assessment that you can check. So as a school library media coordinator, the self-assessment is ongoing. You don't have to just do it at the end, the very beginning, and then you don't look at it again until the end of the year. Okay? So that is a progression. You do that throughout the year. And it is up to the discretion of the school library media coordinator if he or she shares that self-assessment with the administrator. What I say all the time to school library media coordinators, and I say it to administrators alike, is that the rubric, going over the rubric, even though it's not a requirement that the principal go through the rubric before the pre-observation, it is a good idea for the principal, just like the library media coordinator is doing a self-assessment, for the principal or the evaluator to ahead of time look at some of those rubric descriptors, like ones that we're going to look at today. Because it's a great opportunity as a school library media coordinator, if I go through that rubric, especially since some things are new, I might note some terminology or some rubric descriptors that I'm not sure how I'm going to be able to meet. And I would probably want to talk to my administrator about that, about what kind of support there is, because I want to be the best school library media coordinator I can be, not only for myself, but because my students deserve an accomplished, proficient, a distinguished library media coordinator. So I recommend that for the self-assessment for media coordinators, that you go through the terminology, note terms that you want to discuss with your administrator. Maybe if you're not sure if your administrator knows how that might relate to library media, you can facilitate that understanding with the administrator, maybe key points that you want to talk to the administrator about in the pre-observation conference. Same thing for an evaluator. Before that pre-observation conference, take a look at that rubric, note terminology in there, rubric descriptors, and some of the ones that we'll look at that I'm thinking of, for example, that I get lots of questions about, are one of the descriptors for school library media coordinators is that the school library media coordinator participates in the hiring process. or is a mentor. Okay? And we're going to look specifically at that rubric descriptor and talk about that. But if I'm a school library media coordinator and hiring is in the summer, I may wonder, well, how can I participate in the hiring process? There's lots of ways that we'll talk about, but that would definitely be something that I would want to talk about to my administrator in this pre-observation conference. I would note that on my self-assessment to talk to my administrator about, well, how would you like for me to, what do you think this looks like? How would you like for me to participate in the hiring process? How can I help you when in the future you're thinking about, maybe it's technology skills that teachers who are coming in would need to have, things like that. Or if I was a school library media coordinator on a fixed schedule, one of the things that I would definitely want to talk to my administrator about in looking at my self-assessment is how can we work together with teachers to provide more flexible access to the library media center and the resources, because both Standard 1 and Standard 3 have specific rubric descriptors related to that. So if I'm a school library media coordinator and I'm going through that self-assessment, that's going to be something that I want to definitely discuss with my administrator at the pre-observation conference. So it is up to the school library media coordinator's discretion if you want to share that with your administrator, but I think it is a great opportunity to springboard conversations and discussions, because it's very important that at the very beginning of this process, the evaluator and the school library media coordinator are on the same page about what these descriptors mean, what the terminology means, what does it look like, what is it going to look like, what is the evaluator going to see if I'm meeting these performance descriptors, how can I meet those performance descriptors. It's important to have shared expectations and understanding of all of that from the very beginning. And I think that self-assessment can really help springboard some of those conversations. So that's just something to think about as a school library media coordinator. But it is up to your discretion to share your self-assessment with your evaluator. Okay. The next step is the pre-observation conference. And it's before your first formal observation, but the pre-observation conference encompasses a lot more than just the formal observation. Some of the things that should be involved in the pre-observation conference are things like reviewing the PGP. And I'd like to make a note here. Did Gaston County participate in the pilot?
No.
No, okay. So that means that since you all didn't participate in the pilot, none of your library media coordinators used this PGP, okay? And the PGP is actually the last step in the evaluation process, because the point of the PGP is to decide what your goals are going to be, what you're going to focus on for the next upcoming year. But you all don't have this PGP as school library media coordinator since you weren't in the pilot. So that means that you're actually doing a PGP twice this year. So your school library media coordinators, or if you're a school library media coordinator, will have a PGP, and there was confusion about that. Since it's the end of the process, it makes sense that people who weren't part of the process weren't sure what to do with the PGP. So for you all, you'll actually have a PGP at the beginning of this year. Okay, so if you haven't already done a PGP, you need to go ahead and do that. And then you'll do it again at the end of the year for the next year. Okay? So I get questions a lot about what those goals should be. The purpose of the PGP is exactly what is a professional growth plan. It is to help the school library media coordinator grow. So the goals of the PGP should be individualized. They should be based on past performances. When you look at your self-assessment, if there are areas on that self-assessment that are areas that you need to strengthen, or your school library media coordinator needs to strengthen in the library media program, then the PGP goals should be developed around that, because the purpose of the PGP is to help you strengthen the school library media program. For when you're at the end of the year, projecting for next year, of course, you're going to be looking at your performance from this past year. So if there are any areas in the performance that need to be strengthened, those would be areas for PGP goals. But I get questions a lot about, well, what should my PGP goals be? And I can't answer that, because you all have different situations, you have different issues with your programs, you all have strengths in some areas and weaknesses in others. So you are welcome to email me if you have, a certain idea for a goal and you just want to springboard, get some feedback from that. That's fine. But I can't specify what your PGP goals are, because those are individualized based on your performance and your program's needs. Okay? But the pre-observation conference, you're going to go over the PGP. You would also, if the library media coordinator wants to share the self-assessment, you would use that pre-observation conference for that. If the library media coordinator doesn't want to share the self-assessment, you should still use that pre-observation conference as an opportunity to discuss expectations, go over terminology, make sure that you all are both on the same page as far as what is expected coming up. And then, of course, you will also talk about the formal observation and what the evaluator is going to see in the formal observation. And you only have to do the pre-observation conference for the first formal observation. The next step, I get lots of questions about observations. And one of the things that I would like to clarify is that this whole process is the evaluation. And a lot of people use the term evaluation and observation interchangeably, but they're not. Because you have one evaluation during the year, but you have as many as, or as little as, 3 observations during the school year. Okay? So I get lots of questions about how many evaluations do I have, and I think the people who pose those questions really mean observations. So evaluation and observation cannot be used interchangeably. Observations are dependent on your status as a school library media coordinator. If you are probationary status, you have a minimum of 3 observations, and they are all formal observations. And a formal observation is at least 45 minutes, where the evaluator is observing a lesson or session or activity. Okay? So probationary status, there are 3 formal observations. That is a minimum. So that's something else maybe to talk about at the pre-observation conference between the library media coordinator and the evaluator. The evaluator may want to conduct additional observations. That's at the discretion of the evaluator. But that's definitely something to share with the library media coordinator and to discuss. But the minimum for probationary status is 3 formal observations. For career status, you have 3 observations minimum, but only one of those is formal. The other 2 are informal observations. So the formal observation is 45 minutes observing a lesson or session or activity. The informal observations, or the drop-ins, they're 20 minutes and could cover a variety of things. Maybe as an evaluator, since there are lots of rubric descriptors and performance descriptors for school library media coordinators, collaborating with teachers and leading. Maybe one of the informal observations you want to do is if your library media coordinator is training teachers or meeting in PLCs, it may be that that's something that you want to observe. Or maybe the library media coordinator working on the school improvement team in a meeting, maybe that's an informal observation. That's up to the discretion of the evaluator, what informal observations you want to make, okay? But the informal observations are 20 minutes. And again, that's a minimum. So school library media coordinators and evaluators talk to each other so that you know if you want to have additional informal observations, you'll know that ahead of time. Let me pause for a moment since we're halfway through the process. Does anyone have any questions at this point about any of the steps we've talked about? I know I'm going through it quick, but I know that a lot of this is review as well because it's similar to teachers. Okay. So then you have after the observation, you have the post-observation conference. And that's where the administrator comes back contact with the school library media coordinator. It should be no later than 10 days after the observation, so within 10 days, you come back together for the pre-observation, the post-observation conference, and that's where you discuss what was observed in the lesson. It's also an opportunity to discuss, it doesn't have to just be about the formal observation. You can reassess at this point with a self-assessment. You can go back and see what has been observed, what hadn't been observed, talk about performance. You can talk about areas to be worked on for the rest of the year in this conference. Then you have your summary evaluation conference, which is at the end when all of the components of the process have been completed. And the summary evaluation conference is really a conversation between the school library media coordinator and the evaluator on what has been observed, what has been achieved throughout the year. So some of the things that can be discussed in this conference are your ratings, and we're going to look in a minute about how to score the rubric and looking at the ratings. But your evaluator and as a library media coordinator, since you have your self-assessment, you have rated yourself, so you'll want to review that. You'll want to discuss with the administrator what the ratings are so far. You'll want to have your artifacts as a school library media coordinator at this conference, or as an evaluator, if you have collected evidences during the process, to share those. Because with school library media coordinators, there are so many things that school library media coordinators do behind the scenes administratively that administrators may not be aware of or may not have actually observed, but library media coordinators throughout the year are collecting artifacts. So if I'm a library media coordinator and we're looking at the rubric in this conference, and for example, maybe that can go back to that rubric descriptor about being a mentor. Maybe throughout the year, I have been mentoring this new teacher, and I have emails that I've sent to the teacher. I have resources that I've shared with the teacher. Possibly I did professional development with some of the new teachers, and maybe I have an attendance roster for who attended that. All of those are artifacts that I've collected. If that administrator hasn't actually observed me doing those things, I can show my evidences that shows that demonstrates that I have met those performance indicators, and now that block on the rubric can be checked. Okay? And we'll talk more about artifacts, but that's in this summary conference where the artifacts come out, and together the school library media coordinator and the evaluator review those artifacts. Each of the elements is rated on the rubric, and then the ratings for each individual element come together to have a standard overall rating. So as a library media coordinator, I'll have an overall rating for standard 1 and standard 2, and of course that is discussed here as well. And then the evaluator and the school library media coordinator both sign off on it. School library media coordinator has the opportunity for commenting on it. All of those things go on during this summary conference. And then the last step is what we mentioned earlier with the professional growth plan. And for the professional growth plan, if you need details about the different kinds of growth plans, in the user's guide on page 18, it goes over the different growth plans, like the monitor growth plan. But the overall idea, again, for the professional growth plan is that this is a plan that helps school library media coordinators improve their programs for next year. It gives them targeted directions to go in, a focus, and it's based on areas that need to be strengthened, possibly coming from weaknesses or areas in the performance ratings. If there were areas where they did not achieve certain rubric descriptors, performance indicators, then those may be goals for the upcoming year for the PGP. Okay? And this is the step in the process that the PGP is completed for next year. And again, the PGP, you can click on that Mises Wiki, and there's a link there for the PGP. So if you haven't done a PGP, go ahead and do it now, and then you'll also have it at the end of the year as well for next year. Before we look at scoring the rubric, any questions so far about the process? All right. Then let's take a look at how the rubric is scored. If I am an evaluator and I am scoring the rubric, just like the teacher's rubric, I'm going to be going from left to right when I'm scoring each element. So if I'm scoring the school library media coordinator's standard 1 element A, I'm going to be going from left to right. That's the only time as an evaluator you have to move from left to right, when you're scoring the actual rating. And I've gotten this question before too. When you're an evaluator and you are documenting on the rubric what you observed, you don't move from left to right. You document whatever you see on the rubric in the formal observation. You don't have to, for the formal observation, document everything in the developing. If you see them doing something distinguished when you're observing them, then you check it off then. Okay? When you are observing library media coordinators' performance, you don't have to move from left to right. You don't have to say, well, you know, I didn't see everything in developing, so the stuff that I did see in distinguished and proficient, I can't check it because I didn't see this in developing. When you're observing a library media coordinator, you check it as you see it. But when you are rating the elements, that's when you have to go from left to right. So let's look at some examples to just be clear on that. This example, and let's say for element A, I've met with I've had all of the observations, we're in the summary evaluation conference. My school library media coordinator has showed me all of the artifacts that she has that document performance. And for standard 1, element A, this is what I have been able to check. These are the performance indicators that have been demonstrated. What would the school library media coordinator's rating be for this particular element? Proficient, okay? And that's pretty cut and dry because all of the developing are checked and all of the proficient are checked, okay? And there's no accomplished or distinguished, so there's no question there. Let's take a look at this. Element B. What would the school library media coordinator be rated for this element? I'm hearing a couple of distinguished, I'm hearing a couple of developing. Developing is correct. Now, this school library media coordinator has some indicators under distinguished and accomplished and proficient. But when an evaluator is scoring, is rating each element, you have to move from left to right, and the rating is based on the lowest indicator where all of the indicators are marked. So the lowest, like in this case, developing are completely marked, but proficient is not marked. You only have 2 in proficient. You only have 1 in accomplished and 1 in distinguished. So a library media coordinator cannot be considered distinguished for a particular element if they aren't proficient and aren't accomplished. The only thing here that is completed for the library media coordinator is developing. So for this particular element, the library media coordinator would be rated as developing. So let's look at a couple of others just to make sure everything's clear. Let's look at this one. What would the school library media coordinator be rated for this particular element? Accomplished. And the reason this person would be accomplished is because they have developing and you see the word "and" there? Up above, advocates for, and up above, establishes internal and external. It says and. That's for when the evaluator is rating the particular element. Because to be considered proficient, you have to have all of the developing and all of the proficient. To be considered accomplished, you have to have all of the developing and all of the proficient and all of the accomplished, and so on for distinguished. So in this case, the school library media coordinator has all the developing, has all of the proficient, and has all the accomplished. Don't have all the distinguished, they can't go with distinguished for this element. So for this one, they'd be accomplished. All right, one more just to make sure we have it. What about this one? Proficient. Again, they have all the developing and all of the proficient, but they don't have all of the accomplished, so we can't go any higher than proficient. Any questions about scoring the elements? Yes, ma'am.
Just done at the end of the year, final.
Yes. Yep. And then what you do, and it might be beneficial for me to go back to the NISA's wiki and look at these summary rating forms that are required and optional. This is the optional one. And this is for the evaluator. So, like for the evaluator, once you have rated your school library media coordinator on each element, then you look at those elements, okay, and you give them an overall rating. So let's do an example of that, because when you're rating the individual elements, you have to have all of the development, all of the proficient, all of the accomplished to be accomplished. You know, or vice versa. All of the developing, all of the proficient to be considered proficient. But let's take an example. This is an example that's actually in the user's guide. So let's look at this rating sheet. Let's say for standard 1, the library media coordinator rated proficient for element A, proficient for element B, developing, actually, let's just say developing for element B, keep it the way it is in the user's guide. So proficient for element A, developing for element B, proficient for element C, proficient for element D. Okay? So it's proficient, developing, proficient, proficient. What would the overall rating be for that school library media coordinator for that standard? That's the one I get a lot of questions about. Proficient, developing, proficient, proficient. If I'm looking at the overall rating then, the overall performance for that standard, I'm not looking at the individual elements where I have to go left to right, but I'm looking at the overall rating. And they have 3 proficients and 1 developing.
Proficient.
Proficient. And that's where I want to make sure there's clarity, because I know sometimes it can be confusing, because when you're evaluating the library media coordinator for the particular elements, you're moving left to right, and they can't be accomplished if they are missing any of the others. But when you are rating for the overall standard, you're looking at the rating for each element and taking those into consideration, and then coming to your conclusion. And this is a discussion. If you look at the actual language used in the reader's guide, it uses the term consensus, that the evaluator and the school library media coordinator come to a consensus on ratings. Okay? And that's what earlier I referenced, that with the evaluation instrument for school library media coordinators, it's really important that you have a good partnership, good relationship with your administrator, because these are conversations that you have. These are discussions that you have about what has been observed and what this means for your performance. And so in that summary evaluation conference, that's where the media coordinator and the principal look at the ratings and come to a consensus on the overall ratings for the standards. And there's not any kind of numerical, score that you give. Okay? It's just the rating that's given. It's proficient for standard 1, or developing for standard 2, or accomplished for standard 3. So the evaluator rates each of the elements, and then I think this is an optional form, but it's definitely helpful, I think, in keeping up with, coming up with those overall standard ratings. This is the summary form that is required, just so you can see it. And we'll talk a little bit more about artifact in a minute. But it's the same thing. It's a more detailed version of that summary sheet, where you actually note in the summary rating form the artifacts that were used and presented. Okay. So before we look at some specifics on the rubric, any more questions about rating elements, overall standard scores, or the process? Yes.
For career media specialists that are in a non-renewal license year, is there an abbreviated?
That's a great question. I've gotten lots of questions. I got a lot of questions at the beginning of this year about the abbreviated, because I think teachers have an abbreviated. There is not an abbreviated instrument for school library media coordinators. And the renewal year, whatever your renewal year, is irrelevant. It has nothing to do with this. That was a question a lot of people have about the observations or the evaluation in general. Are we only evaluated like the year of our renewal or whatever? No, you're evaluated. School library media coordinators are evaluated every year, and the observations are based on status, probationary or career. So that's a good question. Thank you for asking that. I'm sure other people have that question because I've got emails about that. Any others? Okay, then let's take a look at some rubric descriptors that I want us to have a little bit of discussion about. Let me make sure, this ends at 10:15, is that right, Brent?
Yes.
Okay. So I want to make sure I get good, probably we need at least 5 minutes on the artifacts, but I want to look at a couple of rubric descriptors, and I want you all to have some discussion about what those rubric descriptors would look like, what an evaluator would see if, as a library media coordinator, I am meeting that particular performance descriptor. And you are welcome to email me about any of the descriptors, or if you know specific descriptors that you already have questions about, you can bring them up. But the descriptors that I chose are ones based on in professional development I've gotten lots of questions about, or I've already gotten emails or questions about. So before I show you all a couple of examples and get you to talk about them, are there any specific rubric descriptors that as an evaluator you already know you have a question about, or as a library media coordinator you have a question about? Yes?
If someone is on a probationary contract, the 3 formal, you only do the conference on the first one, correct?
I believe so, but I will check. Yes, I think that's right, but I'll go back and check. When you all are talking, I'll go back and look at the user's guide and make sure I tell you the right thing. Okay, if there's not a specific rubric descriptor, then let's look at some of the ones that I have been asked about. Let's look at this one. This is from Standard 5, the accomplished column. Conducts action research to determine the impact of the school library media program on student achievement. I want you to take a minute and I want you to turn and talk, either to someone beside you or to somebody behind you, of what this would look like. As a school library media coordinator, if I'm conducting action research to determine the impact of my school library media program on student achievement, what in the world would I be doing? What does that mean? What does it look like? Take a minute to talk about it. And while you all are talking about it, we'll go back and make sure I give you the right information about the informal observation.
You do want it to just so like if I'm selected to let you know one master action. Action is one of these things that you can't really have to make what action research is. And it's more to me, it's more research, but it's still go and do the it may be just research, it may just be another it's the action part of research.
Okay, if you'll take a couple of seconds to wrap up your conversation.